Okay, let's dive right into this explainer. When we think about early Buddhism, we usually picture these incredibly serene, exquisite visuals of the Pure Land, right? Perfect figures, deep and silent meditation, just totally detached from the world. But today, we're taking a completely different approach. We're going to use a real historical narrative style to crack open the actual, everyday case files behind the ancient precepts, specifically looking at the typical cases that led to the nuns' precepts. We're going to contrast that pristine image with the surprisingly messy reality of early monastic life. Because, as it turns out, human nature was just as complicated 2,500 years ago as it is today. Seeking enlightenment wasn't just about sitting quietly, it actually required a whole lot of very practical, boots-on-the-ground lawmaking.
Just imagine the scene for a second. Everyday citizens, the very people who are funding these monasteries with their hard-earned resources, just throwing their hands up in absolute frustration. We are starting right in the thick of it here, totally shattering the illusion of flawless ancient monastics with this harsh, real historical criticism from laypeople. Our source text, the 10 Recitations Vinaya, is absolutely packed with these highly dramatic moments where regular citizens looked at the daily behavior of certain monastics and were just scandalized. They literally complained loudly in the streets that these supposedly ascetic nuns were acting way more like secular royalty, a king's wife, or worldly vanity seekers than actual spiritual leaders.
So that brings us to a really fascinating mystery. How did the Buddha handle all this? How did he act not just as a spiritual guide, but as a highly pragmatic lawmaker, dealing with this daily frustrating chaos? I mean, he didn't just sit beneath a Bodhi tree speaking in beautiful abstract poetry all day. He had to actively govern a rapidly growing, highly flawed community of real, everyday people. These were individuals constantly stepping on each other's toes, arguing over daily resources, and inadvertently offending their wealthy lay patrons. The survival of the entire movement literally depended on his ability to maintain order.
To solve this massive headache, the Buddha actually developed a highly responsive, step-by-step judicial formula. These laws weren't just dictated from the clouds. They were built, case by case, entirely forged in the fires of everyday human conflict. First, an incident happened, and a formal complaint was filed, either by a layperson or a fellow monastic. Second, the Buddha assembled the monastic order for a direct, face-to-face interrogation. And third, and only after hearing the facts of the case, he issued a verdict and formulated a brand new, permanently binding rule to prevent it from ever happening again. You can really feel the satisfying, almost systematic rhythm of these historical interrogations as the Buddha cross-examines these flawed individuals. Time and time again in our source text, the Buddha calls the accused forward, whether it's the famously troublesome and outspoken nun Thulananda or someone else, and simply asks the question, is it true? And the absolute honesty required in this legal process was paramount. There were no defense lawyers here, no plea deals. Once they confessed in front of the entire assembly, the judicial machinery smoothly moved right along to the next step. But it's super important to remember that these rules weren't just arbitrary punishments handed down by an angry ruler. No, they were strictly grounded in a philosophy known as the 10 Benefits to justify their creation. Before the Buddha finalized any new law, he explicitly reminded the assembly that this specific rule was designed with a precise purpose. It was there to protect the community's overall harmony, to maintain the public's faith in the institution, and ultimately to help the individual stay on the path toward spiritual liberation.
Let's quickly define this core term straight from our source file, just to emphasize the incredibly high spiritual stakes behind what might seem like mundane rules. A pasijja offense required formal repentance. The ancient text literally describes it as a hindrance causing intense internal burning, something that covers the clear mind. It's a really stark reminder that a breach of daily etiquette here wasn't just a social faux pas. It directly obstructed your path to enlightenment by clouding your judgment.
All right, let's look at Case Files Theme 1, Boundaries Within the Sangha. As we open these ancient case files, keep in mind that these were humans living in very close quarters, sharing limited resources, and naturally, that led to some very relatable friction. We see incredible human nature in these internal disputes, everything from nuns stubbornly giving the silent treatment to their teachers, to interrupting deep philosophical teachings on the Abhidharma, which is the complex psychological analysis of Buddhist doctrine, without any permission. We even see extreme intimidation. One nun named Kala actually terrified her peers by bragging about her connections to kings and generals, literally threatening to use political power to punish them. It really goes to show that strict internal boundaries were absolutely necessary to maintain basic order.
And this brilliantly illustrates how one specific petty argument birthed a lasting institutional law to maintain equality. The Buddha immediately ruled that using outside political or secular power to intimidate a fellow monastic was a severe Pachitiya offense. The monastic order was meant to be a safe refuge, completely separated from the brutal worldly hierarchies of ancient India. This specific, targeted law fiercely protected that egalitarian structure.
Moving right along to Case Files Theme 2, Public Image and Social Decorum.
As we look at these social decorum issues, remember that the public was watching their every single move. And, since they were the financial supporters, they were extremely quick to judge. These surprisingly relatable vanity issues severely offended strict ascetic nuns and lay patrons, forcing the Buddha to intervene. For example, some nuns were caught wearing bright white civilian clothes and jewelry, rubbing expensive scented oils and sesame pastes on their bodies, and loitering in doorways to watch public musical performances. The public was absolutely outraged, complaining loudly that they looked exactly like worldly aristocrats. The Buddha had to systematically step in and make each of these vanity actions a punishable offense.
Now, the crucial point here is the incredible nuance of this ancient law. The Buddha distinguished very carefully between an intentional act of rule-breaking and a simple accident. For instance, if a nun intentionally went out of her way to attend a musical performance or a dance, it was a pachitya, requiring formal repentance. But if she simply had to walk past a loud dance on her necessary travel route just to get back to the monastery, no offense whatsoever. Pure intent was everything in the Buddhist courtroom.
Just as a surprisingly historical and honestly somewhat amusing aside, the source text even lists 3 ancient medical classifications of boils: self-grown, injured, and wind-caused, right smack in the middle of a modesty rule. This bizarre inclusion happened because a nun inappropriately asked a layperson to untie her robes to examine a private boil. The public nature of this was completely scandalous, so the Buddha actually had to step in and legally regulate exactly how medical examinations of private areas could be conducted. It's just amazing proof that his laws had to cover absolutely everything, no matter how awkward.
And finally, Case Files Theme 3, Rules for Facing the Secular World.
Because the daily survival of the ancient Sangha depended entirely on generous donations, donor relations were heavily policed. The Buddha had to strictly regulate behavior at elite events, like royal feasts, and even oversee public sanitation, just to fiercely protect the Sangha's respectable image. We see a shocking case where a nun literally stood at a patron's door, actively turning away other wandering ascetics just so she could hoard all the donated food for herself. In another case, nuns completely destroyed a beautiful, well-kept public grass lawn by using it as a bathroom, which deeply offended the local community who meticulously maintained it.
I mean, imagine being the host of that feast. At a royal gathering we just mentioned, a perfectly healthy nun refused the regular offerings and arrogantly demanded special unboiled medicinal milk and expensive delicacies from her gracious host. In response, the Buddha created the Paridesanyaniya rule, which translates to an offense requiring a specific, formal public confession for this exact kind of greedy overreach. It really shows how deeply he cared about checking personal entitlement and ensuring they didn't burden the generous lay patrons who kept the community alive. We even see highly specific biological realities legislated neutrally and factually, always drawing that strict legal line at conscious, intentional action. The text discusses a strict rule against intentional bodily emissions. However, when honest nuns came forward, really worried because they had experienced this involuntarily during a dream, the Buddha immediately amended the law. He clearly stated that what happens in a dream state is entirely outside of conscious control, therefore there is absolutely no legal offense.
Beyond just punishing bad behavior, the Buddha was building a lasting institution, and that meant establishing formal bureaucratic procedures, like the exact steps required to respectfully request teachings every half-month. The text details precisely how the nun's order was to interact with the monk's order, holding a formal monastery gathering, selecting a representative, traveling safely with a companion, and respectfully requesting the 8 rules of respect. This was ancient institutional management at its absolute finest, ensuring this vast organization ran like a well-oiled machine.
So what you should take away from this explainer is that this ancient text is actually a deeply pragmatic, brilliantly structured legal framework. It shows us that enlightenment wasn't just about escaping reality, it was about masterfully managing it. The Buddha was a brilliant mediator. He fully understood that spiritual communities need clear, legally sound, and compassionate boundaries just as much as they need high philosophy.
I'll leave you with this provocative thought. Perhaps human nature really hasn't changed much in 2.5 millennia, and we still need these exact kinds of guardrails today. Whether it's managing our public image,
enforcing firm professional boundaries, or checking our own personal entitlement, these ancient historical case files still resonate profoundly. Thank you so much for joining me to explore the brilliantly structured, wonderfully human origins of monastic law.